Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Nicoletti today. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, if you don't hear me, just shout. So we're here to, well, you've all just seen the premiere of Wanda's, which is the first short film of Nana Wolke. It's actually really interesting because for those of you who haven't seen the show before, this set of 6 TV screens were completely turned around for the entire duration of the show, and it's only today that it's been unveiled for the exhibition. So before talking about the unveilments of like the TV, I want to kind of briefly introduce yourself, read a bit of your bio, and to give context on your practice. So Nana Wolke is a London-based artist from Slovenia with an MFA from Goldsmiths, the University of London, and a BFA from the Academy of Visual Arts in Ljubljana. Yes. She has exhibited recently at Castor Gallery in London and Bin in Vienna. I would also like to congratulate you for recently being represented by Nicoletti. That's like incredible. Just a few days ago, actually. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Vanessa Murrell, and I'm a curator, writer, and artivist. That's my new tagline. And I'm the founder of the online platform DATEAGLE ART, and also the curatorial collective NıCOLETTı. So I think we should, deep dive, or better, deep drive into Wanda's. I would like to start by asking you, why have you kept this film turned around for the whole time of the show?
There were many reasons for that decision. First of all, one kind of idea that I have with painting and what I'm trying to achieve with it is to sort of pair it with sound and other kind of elements that are not moving image, but the idea is to kind of create editing within painting, and then together with sound play with these different temporalities that each medium has. That's why it was very important for me that even though I was doing, by accident actually, a first short film, to kind of keep that idea of sound and then painting together. And I think one other thing that later on became very interesting for me, and was actually one of the initial ideas that I was quite excited about with the show, is to have that like 10 centimeter gap with screens from the wall. So it's kind of drawing you in to peek behind them and sort of uncover what is hidden from you. And all that you can actually see is this like play of light, and you hear the sound, you see some of the chatter of the crowd. You know that there are kind of different moments playing out, but you can't entirely access them. And I think that really kind of relates back to how I work with painting. Like a lot of these paintings, as you see, are not exactly the climactic moment, but more so almost like if you were to stop, freeze frame a film at a wrong frame, like you deliver a calls and you have to pick it up right now. You just pause it somewhere, and when you come back, that's the image you see. That's the sort of kind of effect I'm going for, where I'm leaving you clues rather than kind of what more traditionally painting does often is, or at least historically, it would be to show the kind of the main event. This kind
I really
of
enjoy when we chatted about the works, because there were all these paintings, and this was of course turned around. You could see the blue lights, and you were chatting about how when you walk through the streets and you're looking at the windows of the buildings, you can kind of see that the neighbors are watching TV through the flickering of the blue lights, and that was kind of the effect that you wanted to give. The combination of like the paintings and the sound combined make a moving image, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of like play with this logic, and I'm just having the maximum amount of fun with film, and then I go back to the studio and I paint as well. And I think that for me is like win-win in life, because I'm just doing both like collaborative work that involves a lot of people and involves aspects of like film
so
process.
That's what I want to ask you more about your collaborative process, because I think it's so interesting that in order to make a painting, you actually start by making a script, and I want you to kind of like guide us through the process of like writing a script, bringing a team of people, photographing, editing, and then painting, and then making sound, and then making a film. Like it's so layered.
Yeah, well, film happened kind of alongside everything. That's what was a bit challenging, but I think also fun because it gave me like that break from painting. But even with the painting itself, I think everything that you see in the space and that you would always see with my previous shows as well, for example, at Win-Win in Vienna, where I also had a sound piece and paintings from the hotel room here in King's Cross in London. It was the first time where I was really kind of like going for that idea of a bit more full on. So, I would prepare a loose script because honestly, that loose script is something for me to start imagining, what the narrative for me is about, what's interesting for me. But obviously it's loose enough that, when I work with people, the best part of collaboration for me is to bring in an idea and then have people add to it. And the most kind of interesting thing is not only when I'm working with actors and models and people that kind of work in the industry and are a bit more familiar with it, but for example, the crowd that you see here in the short film, Wanda's, is actually, partially my friends, very good friends, and people that are more kind of familiar with art or film. And then a pretty big majority of that crowd is actually sourced through an open call, which is just like, you print on A4, very old school, a bunch of ads. And I went around the Westway area and kind of posted them around because I thought it was really important for me to kind of reach that section of people that lives in the area and just knows this space. Because my kind of introduction into the space was more for research and kind of the initial interest that I had in the car park itself because it was so interestingly positioned.
Tell us a bit more about the location, like the roundabout area and this non-space.
Yeah, well, for me, it's not a non-space because I've been there and like I know how people use it and that I know that like people sort of create lives within it, but they're perceived as non-spaces, as you said, because it's mostly a space where you would, let's say, park your car and then leave and do something else. You're not really supposed to stay there or linger around. And I guess like my part of the research before the script ever begins for any of my works is that part where I really kind of stay and I, try and figure out how people are using the space. That's how like I think fiction really writes itself, because you can have amazing ideas about what people could do in these spaces, but if you just stay around, you're gonna find things that you could never come up with that actually seem like fiction, but they're not. And I think that's kind of this thin line between fiction and reality that a lot of my work is kind of playing with, because you might think that something's fiction that's actually reality, and vice versa. It's all kind of integrated together.
There's this amazing quote that I've got here of J.G. Ballard, the English novelist, and he says, given that external reality is a fiction, the writer's role is almost superfluous. He does not need to invent the fiction because it is already there.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us about the fiction that you found when you were in this space.
Yeah, well, the fictional part is still not entirely fictional in a sense, and that's, obviously what you can see here is that there's obviously for me it's like this initial narrative that was interesting for me was the one of the taxi drivers, and that's the painting that you see all the way behind with the taxis sort of parked in this half circle. That was the initial thing that I actually saw when I first came across this car park. And it sort of reminded me of this French film from, I think, 2011, Holy Motors, where the main premise is like, where do all the limousines go after their long day of work? That was a real thing that happened, but it could look a little bit fictional in a sense. And then the fictional part is, apart from like taxi drivers and how they use the space, they leave the cars for a car wash and then they go upstairs to play football. That's what this group of 5 friends was actually doing when I first encountered them. The additional layer to this is Wanda and her crowd. They're also meeting at the car park. That's also their space of communion, but it has this more kind of spiritual undertone to it. And it's yeah, that was like the part that was actually inspired by a car park where my parents live, and me and my parents used to live in Slovenia, where there is a religious group that comes every Friday, and it's 2 p.m. and prays in the car park and uses that space for a bit more like spiritual purpose. And that to me was quite interesting, like a space that, you know, you're not really supposed to linger around, used for something that's quite deep and meaningful to people, and you know how this space is totally recreated in that sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, it still links to some kind of part of reality. It's just like, you know.
I guess at the end of the film we do get to see a bit of that reality with the BDS shot of like the taxis going out of the car park, and we get to see like the football arena at the top of the car park.
Yeah.
Which is where this kind of ritual of the taxi drivers would go there to play football every week. But when you were talking about the spiritual and the holy, I guess that can also be seen in a way with the light, like the blue lights. It's kind of like directing the gaze. And also I think you mentioned about relations with the Papamobile, which I thought was super interesting.
Yeah, well, my research for Wanda was, you know, initially there was this idea of people praying in the car park from my hometown, but then later on I kind of quite organically started looking at different footage of Pope and his different receptions around the world, and the most fascinating out of those, the element that I was really fascinated with and that inspired kind of Wanda's drive is Pope and his Papamobile, Pope-mobile, I guess you call it, Pope car. And with that specific vehicle, what I love the most about it is kind of made as a vitrine almost. It has all these lights that are kind of directed from the bottom towards Pope, so he's kind of highlighted in a very kind of particular manner. And that's how we later on assembled lights in this Defender that was used for Wanda's drive. And Defender is more like, this one in particular was more like an older model. It has like this military feel to it, but it's also kind of lifted from the ground, has like very specific window shield, which was quite convenient for this format of filming as well. It has, we kind of like are almost tied to the screen, to the window shield. So that was kind of the
And we're talking a lot about Wandas, but I guess many people will be lost, be like, who is Wandas? Who from all of these characters is Wandas? And that's one of the things that I found really interesting, that Wandas isn't really seen or like exposed in the film. It's Wandas is like the driver, and
she's driven.
She
would never drive. She would never drive.
Well, she's the one who's being driven, and she's got a cohort, and then it's all of this journey like of Wanda's arriving to this crowd, and this whole like build up and expectation of the crowd, and I just think it's so interesting that the whole show relates to Wanda's, but we don't get to see Wanda.
Yeah, you only get like glimpses of her. I mean, in terms of like the paintings in the show, there is that only kind of smaller piece with Wanda and her arms kind of crossed in the car as she's like driving, and it's almost as if where someone opened the door to her, and she's like, and offered her something, and she's like, no, thank you. And that's the title. Is called
No Thank You.
Yeah, you know, all the titles are kind of like, for me, they're like pieces of missing dialogue. And they're like, a piece of the puzzle sort of to this whole thing.
And you got the name of Wanda's from a book, right?
Yeah, actually, so Wanda is, again, another collaboration that Wanda is initially my great friend and also an artist, Jean-Francois Krebs' character. He was developing this character before we ever put it in the show. But then together, you know, because I initially had this idea and I had like a profile that I was looking at, this kind of like strong female personality, this kind of mysterious but tender, fragile, but also kind of like quite, with quite like an interesting presence, almost like showman type presence, character. And this Jean-Francois Krebs was already kind of working on this character and used it in several of his performances. But then when we started kind of talking about the, you know, Wanda and Wanda is like the main character of this show, we further developed it. But his initial idea for Wanda was, the name comes from Mazok's book, Venus in Furs. And it, you know, it wasn't really, when I was conceiving this show, I wasn't really thinking too much about the whole kind of area of masochism and so on. That wasn't that interesting for me. But when I was reading the book, I was quite inspired by how she's portrayed in this very kind of, there's like this kind of slight power to her. She doesn't have to assert her power. She's just sort of like admired because of who she is, just like as a personality naturally. The kind of like energy she kind of emits. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a collaborative process as well, Wanda. Yeah, it's a shared character in a sense. Yeah. And Jean-Francois is the one impersonating Wanda. So I felt like it was good for him to kind of take on this character and bring it to the show in his own way.
And maybe moving on to like the sound score of like the film, and I know it's related in some way to this idea of the roundabout and the rotation. Yeah,
well, initially when I was in New York in spring, in early May, I heard this carousel waltz, which at the time I didn't really know what it was, but it was just this incredible waltz that was playing around. In Coney Island, they have one of the older merry-go-rounds from, I think it's 1908 that it's from, and this score was accompanying the merry-go-round while it was kind of rotating. And I was trying to Spotify it, but my internet was really bad in the States. So like when I think two weeks or maybe 3 weeks after, all of a sudden it popped up in my phone, oh, we found the song. I was like, okay, that must be, you know, something special now, because I was waiting for it for such a long time and kind of gave up on it. And then this song became something that I got pretty obsessed with, and I introduced it to the composer Gaspar Torkar, who, this is the second show I've been working on with him now. And I gave him this song as a sort of like an inspiration for the waltz that we did together. So it has a similar structure, but he used a lot more like electronic elements to it. Mm-hmm. It sounds old, but it's also kind of, there are like certain twists to it where it just feels a little bit almost uncanny. But I guess what I was really getting at is sort of a celebratory yet slightly dark undertone to the whole score. Yeah, but the general vibe is still kind of something you could waltz to.
There's some moments that feel very celebratory, very carnivalesque in the film.
Yes, yeah, that's the sort of very last moment where the crowd is receiving Wanda, and my idea was for this song to be almost like a glue between the crowd and Wanda and her arrival. So as they're waiting for Wanda to arrive, they're kind of like slowly building up the song, and it's almost like a term under which they have to meet. If they're not performing the song, she's not going to show up. They have to like sort of build it up and support this environment in which, you know, she has this grand arrival. But to return back to this idea of Westway and the location itself, which is very important for the show, Westway is a roundabout, so essentially you have like a lot of massive circles that you can go around. And I felt like it kind of nicely connected to this idea of a merry-go-round in a sense. So that's already kind of, you know, present in the architecture.
Yeah. And there's a central theme within all of your works which relates to shame and desire. Yeah. And I would love you to expand more on that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I guess one of the main elements of my work and how I'm working with all of these spaces is, you know, I'm quite interested in perception, in how, you know, someone is positioned in the space in relation to the subject. That's why the hunting light as well. But, you know, I'm quite interested in spaces that, to me, feel maybe difficult to work with, either for, you know, a personal reason or because, you know, they're kind of historically overlooked or maybe branded in a certain way. I'm quite interested in, like, you know, who reroutes their Uber from a space like that, or, who makes themselves feel comfortable. These are kind of things that are really driving my interest to like stay a bit longer and linger around and kind of like figure out why does it feel uncomfortable.
But this element of shame and desire, is it both for the viewers as well as the characters?
I think, even with paintings, I think, let's say with the taxi drivers, as they're changing, it's almost this kind of uncomfortable moment of being caught changing in a public space where you're maybe not supposed to, and maybe it's almost like a bit homoerotic, in that sense, even though they're not doing anything really, but there's like this kind of tension of like being vulnerable and like seen. And, when I'm shooting all these images from the scripted situations that I prepare for each of my exhibitions and later on become paintings, I'm quite conscious of where I'm standing and which position I'm sort of like looking from. And that's, partially what I was mentioning to you with Andy Warhol had this amazing film, Blowjob, where you only see the guy what seems to be, receiving a blowjob, and he's sort of like making faces, and most importantly, kind of making contact with someone that's not Andy Warhol at the camera, but someone right behind him, and it becomes this like kind of uncomfortable thing of like, okay, who is this person looking at him? Is it like someone else that's also in the room? What is this relation? Is he, faking it? Is it for real? Like, we don't know all of these things. We just only kind of like see reactions and him kind of like making that eye contact. And I think that whole eye contact thing was something that was quite important for me also in creating of the show. And that's why when you see Vanessa kind of like catching us, it becomes this
a bit uncomfortable,
like freak out moment.
I guess with this painting, we cannot have any eye contact directly with the, the people, and it could feel kind of like frightening to see like all of these males just there positioned in front of you, like quite in this way. But then the actual title is very tender. So like there's a complete contrast between like the title and the image.
Yeah, the title is like Uncle Charlie, You Look Beautiful, which I thought was like, for me that was like a very tender scene because when I was shooting that with the taxi drivers who were also, when you were coming here to Nicoletti, you probably saw a bunch of these taxis along the road. There's a taxi repair shop like right next to the gallery, and when I initially saw taxi drivers back in May in the car park, I was really thinking for a long time if I should contact them directly or and work with them on this now like fictional recreation of what they actually do in their real life. And then I was thinking, maybe that's a bit of a weird thing to like intrude on someone's like personal life like that and kind of make them like redo it for me. That's just strange. But then, I thought, okay, maybe we could still reach out to these taxi drivers that are actually there are neighbors at the gallery, and maybe there are 5 people that would want to, with the knowledge of like what it means to do this kind of work and like be in garages like this, work with me on a set, and that would be fun for them and also fun for me because I'm learning from them as we go. And as I was working with these 5 men, it was, that was kind of like the energy that was present, There was quite a lot of vulnerability in that, and like kind of, changing there and, kind of figuring out where the comfort zone is between like, okay, are we taking the pants off completely or just putting them on like that? I thought there was like something about like the body and like, sitting in a car all day and maybe your body's not like looking that good after all these years, but you wants to want to change in a certain way. So
I think there's also an element of humor in the way that it's curated next to the other work, which has all of these machines. Because when you look at them both together, it almost feels like the machines become these men and these men become these machines. Like they're all like standing in this way, in this vertical positioning.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to pair these two together. So I mean, there are 2 reasons why all these works are in a specific position, and one of them is kind of like you said. Yeah, I think there's like a relation to like all these elements in the space. But the other one is like I always map out these spaces with paintings and with how they're positioned in the space. So when you're like in the gallery space and you look around, each painting is giving you a clue to where you're standing within that space. So, you know, you kind of have a sense of how the space performs.
And tell us a bit more about your limited use of color, which is very striking throughout the show as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, I started off with the red hunting light, and I started using hunting lights actually because they're kind of very strong. They have this very strong brightness, and they can perform almost as strongly as certain stage lights. So they have this, like, you know, kind of cinematic look to them in a sense. But they're very easy to use, and there's like a practical reason for that as well, which is, you know, we didn't really get any permits to work in a car park because it's incredibly expensive to rent one. Even Seinfeld, in one of their episodes, when they're filming in a car park, they actually like built it in a studio, a whole set, and then they kind of like used mirrors to replicate it and make it look massive. But, you know, for me that doesn't work because I'm not really interested in spaces that are completely manufactured, but rather spaces that already have life and history and kind of their own flow to it, and then adding to them, or, you know, kind of interacting with these elements that are already present. So yeah, that was, sorry.
With the color.
Yeah, sorry, got carried away. Yeah, so blue light is one of the 4 lights that the hunting light has. The most common ones are red and green, which are also kind of connected with this idea of night vision as well. But blue and yellow are a bit less common, and
because you kind of like, when you see them all together, it kind of becomes black and white in a way, because they're all like they're all the same tones.
Yeah, that's kind of how I like to work with these things, even though there is actual color and, you know, yellow and red and so on, but it has like quite an overall kind of tone to it. And yeah, I kind of like that idea of sort of uniform space. So you kind of really understand, okay, this is all one space. And then the first space when you enter is the football pitch, which is the space sort of right above the car park, which you see sort of in the last bit of the film. And that space is yellow, so you kind of have like a very clear separation.
And you also mix, in the process of painting, this sand element to create a lot of grain. And it kind of is also linked to the ISO of like editing and photographing and the loss of image. So how do you relate painting with editing and with the grainy textures that you use?
I think, you know, the grainy texture just kind of further supports that idea of kind of working with mistakes that I'm quite interested in, and like making it even like a little bit harder to like perfectly render something or kind of define it. But as you said, the graininess that's present in a very kind of high ISO, especially photos that you take like in nighttime, sometimes are not like the best quality. You can get this kind of pretty nasty pixelation to it, or like kind of graininess. And yeah, that's sort of, that's the sketch that I'm working with essentially before I ever start painting, instead of sort of drawing on the canvas and preparing the sketch beforehand. The gesso mixed in with a lot of sand is kind of my guideline to where certain things are going to be placed in. And I think that makes the difference between seeing the works in person and, let's say, photographed later on as documentation, because when you come close to the work, certain works are really kind of quite rough. Yeah, so you only see that kind of when you come closer.
This element of limitations, so there's limitations in the color palettes with the blue, there, and then also like the scale, they're all the same height.
Yeah, you know, the car park's actually only like 190 centimeters high, maybe a little bit higher, which was a massive issue for me at some point because I wanted to drive in with the Defender, and it wouldn't fit because the Defender was like almost 2 meters tall. And that made me think about the actual height of the space. I knew that the space felt quite like, not uncomfortable necessarily, but a bit compressed. So I wanted to kind of replicate a little bit of that idea of like what the height and what the kind of like relation to the body, sort of, what kind of relation to the body do you have in that space. with the height of the paintings, which is 180, which is nearly the height of the car park. Yeah.
Something I also find really interesting about your practice is like how you mentioned this to me as well, that you don't have a style in a way, because like if you see this one, it's like got all of these dots and like elements, and then like you change your style depending on the work as well.
I'm trying to have fun with it, you know. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's hard to escape yourself. So sometimes I see them like, oh, it all looks also kind of like similar. But I'm trying to like not, you know, replicate the same thing. And I'm trying not to like, you know, figure out something and then just do it over and over again, but like really sort of challenge myself and say, okay, can we do it the opposite way? So for example, with the work that's Silence Becomes Prayer, which is the kind of the narrowest piece, the only piece that's showing the crowd outside of the film. I really wanted to have, yeah, this kind of, sorry, what were we talking about? I was like, wait.
I completely lost track. So I know you really love that piece because I mean, for me, it's like the most ambiguous piece because it's like a very close-up shot.
Right.
So you also play with like change of styles. Like this one could.
Right, style.
Honestly, this looks like petals in a road, and it's like it's so beautiful. But then there you get like these figures, and then there you don't get anything.
Yeah, you know, that's the one, Silence Becomes Prayer.
Yeah.
I got lost because that is the only work that's done in a bit of a different way, in a sense. So instead of, a lot of this work that you see here is sort of built through layering. It's almost like printing, if you will. And a lot of kind of layering of opposing colors as well. And that work was actually done in a way where I would just cover one thick layer of the paint and then erase out of it. And I did it all the way at the end where I felt kind of, okay, you know, this whole show is almost complete now. I want to do something that I haven't done yet, and just sort of get out of this like system that's already kind of in place now. So yeah, it's important for me to like really, you know, push it every time and just find something new.
So I realize we're kind of finishing the panel talk. Before opening to the questions, I want to end on a quote that I read from an interview that you did recently. Mm-hmm. And it relates to the idea of like shame and desire, mm-hmm. and peeking into these moments where I don't know if I'm supposed to be peeking, like what's like the private moments or the public moments. So it relates to that. Mm-hmm. And you said, shame is a compass and a productive force that leads me into unexpected territories with vulnerability and courage. Behind that which we are ashamed of lies something complex of how we see ourselves, the sticky stuff. I spent a lot of time hiding that I grew up in the socialist blocks in Yugoslavia during my early childhood. Mm-hmm. So, and I know that you don't explicitly talk about like something autobiographical, but it is in some way there.
Yeah, I think, you know, that this relates back to this idea of transitional spaces. Transitional spaces for me are, you know, all these spaces that are kind of, even with, let's say, socialist blocks in Yugoslavia, you know, they're always, what was interesting for me is that like they're always kind of pushed towards the edges of towns. So, you know, the historical town is preserved, and then there are kind of like these main highways or roads leading out to the outskirts. And that's, that was actually a Swedish model, the 1 Million project that was built, I believe, in the 70s, where they started this kind of like structuring of the cities where the inner part is still very beautiful, and we don't really have to look at the neighborhoods outside, and they're also very like self-sustaining. So you have like, you know, a hairdresser, you have all the stores, you have, you don't essentially have to leave it. And that was, you know, what was interesting for me with the Westway as well, because it has its own kind of social complexity as well. On one side, we have Grenfell, which obviously was a huge tragedy, and an example of like really problematic social housing. And then on the other side, you have one of the most prosperous neighborhoods in London. And the Westway is this kind of like separation right in the middle, and there are a lot of like really interesting community centers and sports centers, and they used to have these like pony rides at some point right underneath it. So it has like this really kind of multi-layered existence that's just right in the middle of it all. And there's something that's quite interesting about that, you know, that it's in between, and that's something that I'm kind of familiar with in my own way. But, you know, I think with each space, it's really important for me to kind of learn about it more. And
I would be very interested to know if anyone here has been to Westway as well.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes?
Yeah, I have.
Oh.
But really, I've like been nowhere in London except for, but I have been in it's at the sports center.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's where it's
Yeah, I was
shot.
like, I can't believe I know this one place.
Yeah, yeah.
But you're right, it does have a really interesting, because you can walk straight from Notting Hill and you're kind of like here at this intersection. And I think, this might be totally wrong, but I think there's like sort of this space where they do kind of like dancing and festival kind of like in randomly right over there.
Yeah, there are a bunch of different things around it. It's like such an active
There's, like, little
space.
pockets every time I was looking at a flat, and then I got there, and then they were like, okay, I can get a bit loud here because people kind of like dance and everything.
Yeah, you know, that was part of kind of inspiration for me to have the crowd really like go at it, and in the end almost sort of like lose themselves in this celebration, because when I was initially visiting the Westway area, on Fridays and Saturdays they would often have this like live music that I think you're talking about, like speakers out, you know, car doors open. I think during summer they also had like some food outside, and it was just so amazing, like really incredible vibe. So yeah, I think there's just so much going on there that's just completely kind of, you know, yeah. It's
So
something.
I want to open up as well for any audience questions that you might have.
Hi, it's
Hi.
nice to meet you. So this is a long-winded question, but I'm going to have a go at it. So mostly when you think about traditional paintings, you look at the painting and then you have the story, at least from a consumer's point of view. But it sounds like what you do is you first have a story and then you have a painting through various steps in between. So I guess the question comes, is that a perspective? And as I was looking at your short film, I felt like I was third person riding along with Wanda
Mm-hmm.
and probably the city because kind of go through it. So what was your perspective when you were shooting that?
Yeah, you know, I try and put myself in different perspectives and like different people that I imagine are in the space. So I think I really love to hear that like you felt like you were actually driving in the car, because that's how we were positioning the camera actually, you know, so it's kind of at the back seat. So you're that like kind of third person, you know,
Looking
peeking.
over your shoulder.
Exactly, yeah. And then you have the showgirl on one side and the driver on the other, and Wanda is supposedly next to you. So who
and
are
I
you?
guess like how the TV is positioned as well, it kind of reminds of a car, of the frontal car window in
Yeah.
a way as well.
As well.
But
as
this
well.
has an interesting relation with the space as well, the choice of the 6 TVs.
Yeah. You know, the 6 TVs are actually, I saw in the car park they had several TVs assembled in a CCTV room. So when I was thinking about like the film presentation, I felt like it'd be nice to retain some kind of element of the space itself, even though, you know, yeah, it does something else to the film. So
Were you in the car is my question.
I was in the car. Oh my God, I was like, where was I? Yes, of course I was in the car. Yeah, I was in the car. I mean, I'm the showgirl. Oh my God, I forgot. Yeah, I was the person sitting next to the driver with the hat, and I say, Wanda song, please. So yeah, I was always kind of like somewhere in there, and also like in the film when they're walking, the sort of the taxis are driving out. It's that final thing where I wanted to kind of connect, you know, the first initial moment when I saw taxis in the car park, and then have like the very kind of last little bits, little behind the scenes of the film, taxis driving out, and then it's like the showgirl and the 2 Great Danes that you see in that painting, ladies and gentlemen as well, presents. It ties back. It begins with the taxis, and then ends kind of with the taxis in this space. But yeah, like I think you're onto something here with, there's a lot of kind of scripted, thought through stuff, but it's very kind of, it leaves a lot of space for people to like direct it in a way where it feels relevant to where it's actually located and who these people are as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if anyone else might have, yeah?
Yeah, my question is, it's really interesting, especially I also come from a background in Yugoslavia, and kind of, I would be interested in what's your relationship with nostalgia, because I have a feeling that in a lot of these kind of transitory spaces, it's either a space that will soon end, because obviously we know that in London a lot of these places are heavily gentrified, and then in terms of Yugoslavia, even though me it's kind of interesting, this approach to Ljubljana being like the socialist blocks, but also like, because from other places in Yugoslavia we don't really see it this way, but anyways, maybe these are places that are somehow, you know, romanticized in a certain way, especially, you know, nostalgia about places in London, how they're going to disappear, Yugo nostalgia about something that's a political system that doesn't exist anymore, but how we imagine it, is this something that is kind of important in this narrative or connection that you were thinking about?
Yeah, no, you know, I don't really have that kind of intense nostalgia about any of these things. I think, you know, when I was really going to this car park, I was more so interested in like how it is sort of at the present moment, and this kind of like capsule of time sort of, which I'm trying to kind of go at, and really this activated moment of how the space is used, rather than like what might have happened with it, even though you're absolutely right. I think, you know, a lot of these spaces might be under threat, though, because this is located so close to Grenfell, I think the communities there are very strong, and I hope they will, you know, continue doing their work and kind of enriching that space further. But yeah, when I think about my own background, you know, I don't really kind of keep it in the foreground of what I do necessarily, but I am always aware that, you know, there's no point in kind of escaping yourself. There are certain things that are interesting to us because we relate to them and because, you know, we're familiar with them. And it just feels like a bit more of a honest and kind of open and also tender entry point into something that is also really complicated for other reasons. But it just gives you that kind of, it gives you that kind of like openness and the right mindset, I think, to work with people from a lot of different backgrounds and to just kind of like, you know, really go with things and like open up new doors, essentially.
Are there any more questions? So,
I have one more.
yeah?
Sorry, I had one more. It's really interesting because you mentioned being uncomfortable quite a bit. I'm almost wondering if it's important to you to highlight what people usually overlook.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that discomfort so important to you?
Yeah, you know, discomfort for me is just like something that it ties to a lot of norms and values that are attached around certain things. So if I'm uncomfortable about something, that must mean that there is something in place supporting that discomfort and like telling me that I should feel a certain way about this. So there's just, you know, a little kind of question mark around that. But yeah.
And this idea of the mundane, which
Yeah.
she was asking
Mm-hmm.
about, I remember, like you mentioned, in order to do this film so mundane, you have to go super overboard with lighting, with props, with this, and then with the paintings, it's the opposite in a way.
Yeah. You know, film has very different rules to even photography. And especially then, you know, how it's rendered in painting. In painting, you can take so many elements out. It's really that push and pull between information.
Because there's also that issue of oversharing in a painting. But
Yeah.
you're definitely not doing that.
Well, especially I think with like any sort of figuration, you kind of have to edit within that. And that's really, you know, what I'm trying to do, even when I'm selecting at the end images that I'm working with, which I kind of consider as scenes, as these like different moments in time. It's very important for me to kind of look at a lot of different material and not really decide on like one specific work unless it's in relation to another. So it's really all about kind of timing and gluing back together. And yeah, in film you have to, which I learned over this process, you know, you really have to add a lot of additional lights, even when we were shooting the crowd, which was supposed to be kind of a bit more of a natural environment. It felt quite important to still like present it in a way where you can actually like see people properly and like have this dim light still somehow like highlight certain characteristics. So it's a very different game. It's a craft on its own that takes a lot of people that have a lot of different, you know, knowledge and expertise, and just kind of working with a whole team on each shot. Yeah.
And that's why they're credited at the beginning of the...
Yeah, you know, I always feel like in art, you know, there's always this one person that everyone at the end, you know, thinks about when they're talking about the work. But the type of work I do, I think it's so necessary for me to at the end say, okay, these were all the people that helped me working on this project, and without it, it just wouldn't exist.
Yeah, I can see many of you are here as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, and you know, that's the way that I like to work, because it just makes it a lot more unexpected for me, and like kind of keeps me, you know, challenging myself and kind of going into new directions as well. And you know, I just always feel like everyone should receive their, you know, credit at the end when they've done something.
Amazing.
It's
I just
important.
wanted to end on a note that we actually have a stolen item on view here as well.
Yeah, we do.
I don't know if that's something you wanted to mention or not.
Yeah, it's a borrowed item from the car park, which I'm intending to. I think what I'm intending to do actually is to make a new. There's a sign in the beginning when you come to the gallery. It says cash only, and what I wanted to do is to sort of make a new one for the car park as a sort of like a gift for, you know, lending me unknowingly their space for many months. So yeah, that's the only item that's kind of really the item from the space itself. That's kind of bringing you back to the materiality of the space.
Amazing. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for your time today, and all of you as well. You're free to ask questions to Nana or to myself or to the Nicoletti team on a one-to-one if you'd like. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you.